As an Italianist and as Professor of Italian at the University of Manchester, I'm particularly interested in Renaissance Florence. I work on the Renaissance city, and Florence is probably the most studied city in the Western world. And what fascinates me and my particular investment in the Cities at Manchester project is precisely the way in which Manchester imagined itself in the image and likeness of the mercantile city-states of late medieval and Renaissance Italy. And it's that cultural heritage that I'm interested in working on out of my particular concern with social practice and civic space, specifically on the verbal economy of the city, the way in which there was a confluence between the revival of interest in classical rhetoric and its translation into the vernacular, into Italian from Latin, and the way in which that expertise in public speaking found its way to a new lay constituency and audience who found a political voice within these civic spaces that were constructed in Florence during the late medieval and Renaissance period. So the way that I'm interested in Cities at Manchester is the way in which that paradigm, that set of relations translates itself in the 19th and the early 20th century to the city of Manchester itself. The way in which Mancunian philanthropists and businessmen imagine themselves very much in the image and likeness of the merchant bankers of the Renaissance. People tend to laugh when you suggest that Manchester was the Florence of the 19th century, but the reality is that many contemporaries saw it in those terms. And it was precisely the combination of trade, of education, of philanthropy, of civic pride, of library building and of architecture which animated the 19th century urban planners, architects, philanthropists and scholars to see in late medieval and Renaissance Italy, and specifically within Florence and Venice, trading cities which combined that nexus of activities in a very successful way to generate a very strong local civic identity. And we're incredibly lucky. Behind me here is the figure of Aldus Manutius, who was the very famous Renaissance printer from Venice, who invented the italic typeface. And it was through the agency of the Christie family, and Christie was one of the earliest chancellors of the university, that we have some of the early Italian printed books from before 1500 in our collections at the John Rylance Library, which also houses the Spencer collection from Althorp from the Spencer family. So as a historian of Italian Renaissance culture, having these materials, having this cultural heritage in situ in Manchester and being able to work on them is a fascinating opportunity and of great interest to me. But I'm also interested, in a sense, in the way in which we activate that cultural heritage, the way in which we actually bring it into our research culture as part of the broader story of telling the history of Manchester as a city, the way it has reinvented itself, the way it has looked back into the past to try and find a model for its own self-imagination. And it's the dynamism of the city and its ability to reinvent itself that I find particularly suggestive and animates my research. So I'm really enjoying the combination of the historical research that I do within Florence itself, at looking at its own streets, its own piazzas, its own buildings of monuments, its own collecting of materials and of books and of prints and of images as well as texts, and seeing how those are kind of replicated, if you like, within Manchester. What was that compulsion to look back? And also, what does that mean in terms of the way in which we look forward? How did that model of combining the humanities, the building and construction of universities, of libraries, of streets, of architecture, how did that nexus of activities serve to construct the city of Florence, and how did the imitation of it condition the fabric of Manchester? And what does that mean as we look forward in terms of our thinking around what the importance of the humanities is within the city, what the role of a university is more broadly within a city, and how do we activate that cultural heritage in a dynamic way to tell us a story about the past, but also to think about what our responsibilities are in relation to that tradition as we move forward.